Welcome to the Jay Martin Show. If you are new to the show, my name is Jay and I am an investor looking for the smartest home for my cash. Maybe that's just like you. If it is like you, I think you're going to like what we do here. My guest today is Egon von Greyerz, who is the founder of Matterhorn Asset Management, the world's leading storage for physical precious metals. Now, the reason that I wanted to talk to Egon today is that he always has an interesting take on geopolitical events, often a counter perspective to what not only the mainstream media is saying, but what a lot of people in macro are thinking and saying. And so I wanted to pick his brain today on his thoughts on, what inning are we watching right now in terms of the rise and potential fall of the US empire. I've got my thoughts. I wanted to know his. Number two, what are the threads within the European conflict that the public and media are just missing point blank? And number three, what can we do in terms of positioning ourselves physically and geographically speaking? I'm the father of 3 young kids. I'm right now thinking through, where do I want to lay my foundation, right? My family's foundation to set my grandkids up for success. And I'm talking about geographically speaking. And so we're putting down roots in Indonesia and Southeast Asia right now. We've got passports to Canada and the US. We've got some optionality in Commonwealth countries, but I'm thinking forward. I was really blessed to have grown up in the 90s in Western Canada. It set me up for success. I want to make sure I set up my kids and my grandkids in a similar fashion. It's a very complex question to answer right now, though, so I appreciated Egon's take. As always, right beneath this piece of content, there is a link where you can subscribe to my weekly newsletter. I am an investor and I manage a portfolio of early stage companies. However, what I write about isn't managing money. I write about managing my mind. Without question, the most important tool in every investor's toolkit. We dive into the heuristics and biases and blind spots that govern our best and worst decisions as investors, leading to success or failure in these markets. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I enjoyed recording it. Here is Egon von Greyerz. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am with Egon von Greyerz. Egon, it's great to have you back on the show. Thanks so much for making the time.
Jay, really pleased to see you again. A lot to talk about, as always.
Lots to talk about. Okay, so here I'll start with a broad question, and then I'll just pull on threads. We'll go from there. I'm watching a blueprint being played out right now, specifically in the United States. This is the blueprint that we saw towards the end of the Spanish Empire, the end of the Dutch Empire, the end of the British Empire. Typically, 3 things start to happen simultaneously. Number one, the balance sheet goes south, right? And the empire as an organization, by any measurable metric, becomes insolvent. And in response to that, they began rapidly devaluing their currency to paper over the losses. Simultaneously, you typically see massive expressions of civil unrest. This is internal conflict within the country, generally in response to increased wealth gaps. We're seeing that right now happen at the same time. And the third bucket that often occurs in the final innings of an empire is external conflict. Competing powers begin jockeying for a bigger slice of the pie. This usually erupts in trade wars, economic wars, and hot wars, which we are also simultaneously watching right now. Am I being too dramatic, though, when I compare today's scenario towards the final innings of the Spanish, Dutch, and British Empire? What are your thoughts?
Well, most people who heard me would say that you're not too dramatic at all, from the point of view that I view the world, because for the last 20 years, I've been preparing for this cycle turn. And I think, as you say, this is a major cycle. Nobody will know until future historians, what the magnitude of this cycle. But whether it's a 300-year cycle or a 2,000-year cycle, I think is a major cycle. And all the factors that you just mentioned, that they are typical for the end of one of these cycles, and I think it could be catastrophic for the world. Now, cycles don't end, in one go. We have, it's a gradual process. But to quote Hemingway, it's first gradual and then sudden. And I think we are still going to wait for the sudden activity or action, which could happen tomorrow, or it could take another 5 years or so. But I think we are near, and we have all the signals. What you didn't mention, I think, but it's part of the end of these cycles is, of course, debt and currency debasement. And that's really, I'm worried about. I'm really, I'm an old timer, of course. I now don't worry about short term swings. I don't worry about short term gains or investing for the short term. I'm looking at really protecting myself and the people who listen to us. Protecting us against the risk that you were just outlining, and the overwhelming danger and risk is, of course, debt. So we don't have. I don't care about the timing anymore. I don't care if the stock market crashes tomorrow or it takes 5 years. Don't care about the debt, and the debt markets will crash, and that again could happen at any time. Sure, governments around the world and central banks will do all they can to manipulate these markets and stop it from crashing, but in the end they can't. There's no remedy anymore. They haven't got any weapons. Of course, they'll print more money, but the money is worthless, and it's going to. And in the exponential phase, it is totally worthless. I mean, I've written about on the website a couple of times or a few times about what an exponential phase means. This first gradually and then suddenly, and you take and you see those exponential phases in takes hyperinflation, for example. Initially the inflation goes up gradually, and then all of a sudden, taking Weimar in the early 1920s, it first went up slowly, and then all of a sudden, 23, it went from 100% to hundreds of thousands of percent, and that's what we're going to see at some point. And I took the example of filling a stadium with water, and if you fill it with one drop at a time and then double it every minute, it takes 50 minutes to fill the stadium by doubling it every minute. Hard to imagine, but what most people don't understand is if you ask how long. How full is the stadium after 45 minutes? Well, it's only 7% full. And that is how we explain these exponential moves. It's 45% full after 45 minutes. In the last 5 minutes, it's 7% full after 45 minutes. And the last 5 minutes, it goes from 7 to 100% full. And I think that's what we're going to see in this debt first explosion, and therefore inflation in the explosion to potentially hyperinflation, and then of course thereafter we will have an implosion of debt and assets. So that's the scenario I see, and I think now that the risks I'm looking at around the world, and of course we have to add to the 325 trillion global debt. And remember, in 1971, it was only 4 trillion. It's gone from 4 to 375 since Nixon closed the gold window. And that shows you what happens when discipline goes. It's a free for all. And of course, that's made a lot of money and a lot of people very wealthy, and also given a lot of people a lot of power that is totally abused. But it's all leverage, and that leverage is now going to just implode in at some point. I mean, the risk is very high. I don't forecast timing anymore of these things. I'm just saying I'm quite happy with just protecting my risk as far as I can, and let other people speculate in the markets and ride the last bit of the stock market up, which I think actually is not going to happen because I think it's finished. But that implosion of debt markets, implosion of bond values, that's what's going to kill the world economy totally.
Okay. First of all, thank you for not predicting. I put zero weight on date predictions anyhow, because I feel it's impossible to time markets and big cycles like this. I don't want to sound too dark or dire. The reason I ask this question, though, Egon, is because we often make the mistake, and I'm pseudo quoting Ray Dalio right now, by assuming that because something has not happened in our lifetime yet, it probably won't happen. Whereas we can look through, a couple 100 years, 100 years earlier, 200 years earlier, and see that many crashes like the one you're describing right now, an implosion of debt and all assets, occurs with frequency, just not more than once in generally in people's lifetime. So all I'm saying is that it's easy to assume this will not happen because it hasn't happened in our lifetime. If you grew up in the West, as I did, that doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Might even mean that it's more probable, actually. The U.S. is on pace to add another $1.9 trillion in debt annually, which is the equivalent of Canada's GDP for context. When you talk about the implosion of debt and all assets, can I pick that apart a little bit and just ask you, are there certain metrics that you are watching to give you a clue that we are accelerating down this path, right? Because as you mentioned, how did you go broke, gradually, then suddenly? We're in the gradual phase right now, but are you watching anything specifically that will give you conviction that we're hitting suddenly or we're close to it? Or is that even possible? What do you think?
Well, there are lots of small signals, but there are afterwards they will be seen to be much bigger than they look today. And the first warning sign we got recently was, of course, the Ides of March, the middle of March, when 4 U.S. banks went under in a matter of days. And a few days thereafter, Credit Suisse, the second biggest bank in Switzerland, went under, or was taken over because there was fear that it would go under. And I think, to me, those kind of signals we get more and more of, and of course we know that defaults in the consumer market is increasing, constantly bankruptcies are increasing, but it's not at a level yet when there is panic. But you take the banking sector. The Fed is basically instructing banks on a daily basis to reduce their lending, and that will have a disastrous effect for the banking sector and for loans, because people actually, you take the commercial property in the US. It's a total disaster. It's the same in Europe. So we have the signals, and of course, people now, you've had a situation in the West where costs have gone up massively, and that's for the normal people. You're talking about food, you're talking about fuel, talking about rent or interest rates, etc. Now, has been a small correction to this uptrend in inflation, but that, I would say, a part of that, that U.S. inflation isn't down to 4%, because if you speak to, and the same in Europe, it hasn't come down by that amount. Because if you speak to anybody, buying food, buying petrol or gasoline, or paying for insurance, or paying school fees, or whatever, everything is up by 10 or 20%, not by 4%. So it's killings. There is just, again, they're cheating. Because it suits them from the point of view indexation of pensions and social security payments, etc. So I think the signs are there. They're not yet of a magnitude that creates any panic in the market, because we've had, of course, capital markets and investment markets which have been totally spoiled by a continuous stream of money creation that miraculously has kept the world going for much longer than I thought. I definitely, I was expecting things to happen in around the 2006-09 period there. and so did many others who were analyzing these markets. But they did a good job in saving it. But at a massive cost, because debt has gone up exponentially since then. And just in the last 4 years, for example, U.S. debt has gone up by 21 trillion. It's just mind-boggling. So yes, it's. I thought it would happen earlier. It's and it could. Of course, sure. Things always, when you are at an end of a major era, and we are right in the midst of it. We think that because we see it today, you and I, we see the risk, we see what's happening. We think that it needs to happen quickly. But if you're looking at the end of a super cycle, I would call it a super cycle. You can call it a fourth turning or whatever you want to call it, depending. But I think the cycle is bigger than just these Niemhauer turnings. But so I think we are looking at the end of a longer period. We have never in history had a global bubble of this magnitude. You've had debt bubbles around the world in individual countries or possibly continents. You have not had it in every single country around the world before. And that's the big difference. And that's why, you have it in the West, of course, America, Europe. But you have it also in China, you have it in Japan, you have it in Australia. Most countries have it, and that's never happened before in history. And that's why I think we are at the end of a much bigger cycle, because before there was always another country to save. To save a country. If Argentina went under, which is done many times in the last 50 years or so or more. Then there was always a country that could print some money and help them and lend them some money. But here you're talking about now global debt, obviously said 325 trillion. And I think that at some point, the derivatives, which I think are much higher than we are seeing officially published by the BIS, Bank of International Settlement, they're publishing 650 trillion. But they halved it about 12, 13 years ago from 1.3 quadrillion to 650 by a bit of offsetting and netting. But I think that the gross figure then was and still probably correct of 1.3 quadrillion, and I think that one has easily gone up to 2.5 quadrillion. If you take the whole of the shadow banking system also. Which is very difficult to actually measure. But if you take that, I think we can talk about over 2 quadrillion, and a lot of that is quasi debt. And if we get an implosion, a lot of these derivatives will actually translate into debt, in my view, and also has to be settled by central banks. And that's why we get into this exponential phase when money printing and inflation goes up exponentially, because the problem is much greater than anybody realizes. That's why we should not worry about when it happens. We should not worry about if we can make that last penny on stocks going up, because as I said before, central banks have kept them happy for now, at least since 1971, by always printing money when something's happened. And so we had the first warning in 2008-9. That miraculously then was saved by central banks by printing, tens of trillions of dollars and euros, etc. I think next time it will have no effect, and next time the problem will be much greater. Then God help us, because I think it could, as you said at the beginning, we are maybe darker, as your background shows, than many people. But I'm not a pessimist. I'm just my whole life I've tried to understand and analyze risk and protect against risk. That's all I've been doing. I love life. I think, I had a wonderful life, and most people today have. Um, but it's not a question of being pessimistic. It's just a question of understanding that you're looking at a risk that globally has never, ever been seen in history before.
I publish a weekly newsletter every Sunday. If you would like to subscribe, hit the link right beneath this video. Now, I'm an investor, but I don't write about managing money. I write about managing my mind. Without question, the hardest and most important part of allocating capital through volatility and getting some back. If you want to read my newsletter, hit the link right beneath this video. I know you'll love it. Now back to the interview. Enjoy. For sure. Yes. And I align with that. I'm also super optimistic, to be honest, about my grandkids' future. I've got 3 young boys, but here's where my question and concern comes from is that, so I grew up in the 90s in Western Canada. As a consequence of that, I was set up for success, surrounded by tons of opportunity, great education, employment, predictable, safe governance, all of this stuff. I'm now thinking forward, though, where should I build my foundation so that my grandkids could be similarly set up? And I look at the globe and I'm like, I don't know where to go. And so in response to that, my wife and I are building in as much optionality as we can right now. So my family is dual citizens. My kids are all American, Canadian. I'm Canadian. My wife's American. We're spending a lot of time in Indonesia right now. We're going back in February and putting down some roots there. So we have sort of a foothold in Southeast Asia, close to Thailand as another option. But, I'm just looking at the global chessboard and I'm like, where is the geography that I could lay a foundation today that will set my kids, 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, and therefore my grandkids up for success. And it's quite hard to figure that out. If you have any comments on that, I'd love to hear them. But also, I'm going to tie in 2 questions here. You mentioned a more dire outlook for China, and I just want to pull on that thread a little bit because a common theme in response to the decline of the American empire, if you want to call it that, is that China is the #1 competitor. They are more competitive from a productivity standpoint now. They currently make up more global trade than the US does, which is abnormal for the distributor of the global reserve currency to not also be have the largest share of global trade. China has that now. But I look at the demographics, I look at the debts, I look at the ghost cities, like 20% of the real estate in China is vacant. There's a lot of really serious problems. And so I'm not as confident that the baton will just be passed from the US to China, whether that's 10, 30, 40 years down the road. What do you think, Egon?
Well, to deal with your first point, it's very where to live and how to protect yourself. That's a very, very difficult decision, and most people don't have the choice. This is a choice of luxury that you have, and that we have that can move around. And I live in a few different countries also. Now I'm in Sweden, but then Switzerland, and then have children and grandchildren in the UK. So I do move between those countries. You could say that out of those 3, probably Switzerland is probably the best country from an economic point of view and from a safety point of view, crime, etc. But it's in the middle of Europe. But nevertheless, the Swiss are. I would say that the Swiss political system is the best in the world. There's no question about it. The direct democracy that exists in Switzerland that doesn't exist in any other country in the world. So, so for most people, it's not a question of where shall I go. It's a question of how do I survive where I am, and of course that's where I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but at the end of the day, it's all about having a group of family, friends helping each other, and that doesn't cost much. Sure, you have to have a roof and you have to have food for the day, but you don't need iPhones, iPads, several cars, etc. We don't need to run traveling around the world all the time. People don't need that. And then, as I often say, there are lots of free things in life. Nature. I've got the sea behind me. Mountains, books, music, etc. And then, as I said, a group of friends if we change our values, which happens after, that's what the world needs now anyway. I mean, the world is just adoring the golden calf now, and lost all sense of value or values. And so that's what needs to change. And that's why we need these forest fires. This is going to be a major one that, basically everybody has to start fresh again from a low level, and people have to not start helping each other rather than only thinking about themselves. But anyway, so that's that part of it. But yes, of course, and there are countries that are slightly better to live in, but it's much more difficult today than it's ever been, because there's a risk everywhere in every country now. There's no really safe country anymore in the world. And with the migration that you're getting, I mean, that's going to increase migration into the US. I mean, I see pictures and films that are always frightening. Migration into Europe and boats coming into the UK, etc. There's all the frightening. I mean, it's everywhere. So it's going to be tough for everyone. But anyway, let's go back to China. And you said, yes, China will have massive problems, just like the rest of the world, as you just outlined. I mean, they have a debt situation and a speculative bubble that will burst. There's no question about it. And if you then have a Western world, which is the region importing most of the stuff that China exports, they will suffer dramatically, and there will be major defaults in China. Of course, there will be. The advantage they have compared to most countries of the West is that it is a closed economy and it's a closed capital system. So they're not dependent on financing or capital from the rest of the world, and therefore they can deal with their own financial collapses internally. So that's a great advantage, and I'm sure that they will be very skillful in dealing with that. Still, at the end of the day, people are going to suffer in China too, and there will be a lot of bankruptcies in all areas of the country, and therefore people will be worse off. The big problem then China will have is, to keep the peace, they have to feed everybody. As long as you have food and a roof over the head, they can probably keep the people relatively content. But if they don't do that, there is obviously a risk of revolution in China also, as we have seen in the past. So that's a risk that I don't worry about it in a major way, because it's nothing I can do about it. But I'm aware that that's a possibility. But as I said, from the point of view of actually organizing their own affairs when they are under tremendous economic and financial pressure, China can probably deal with that better than most countries, in my view, to answer that question.
Okay. I want to pivot then to the Ukrainian war, because before we began this interview, we shared some notes, and I asked, what are a few key things that the media and the public are misunderstanding? And you said many things, one of which is the Ukrainian war, due to the propaganda surrounding this conflict. So from a high level, I'd love to just have you describe how you see it. I think, what most people in the West at least see is, Russia beginning to feel cornered as UN countries continue to encroach on their borderlands. In response to this, they've invaded some historic territory in order to recapture that and repatriate it. What's the plot line that you're watching, Egon, and maybe people are missing?
Well, this is such a sad situation. It's what we can clearly see here is, well, in my view, I'm very clear about what's happening. It's not a war, Ukraine against Russia. It's the United States against Russia. I'm absolutely clear about that. And the US has told the Western world to follow them with sanctions, sending weapons, sending money. And the Ukrainians don't want war. The Russian people don't want war either. And the US people don't want, no people ever wants a war. It's only the leaders who want the war. I mean, that's the sad thing about wars. But what we're seeing here, that there is no attempt whatsoever to send peacekeepers and to think about how do we settle this problem. And instead, everybody's sending more money and more weapons. And, I said from day one, Ukraine will never win this war. There's no chance for Ukraine to win against Russia. And whatever, in the beginning, for every little small victory that Ukraine had, everybody said, the Russians are losing them, and they're not going to, Putin is going to be murdered or by his own people, or they're going to lose the war anyway. They won't lose the war. They can't lose the war because there's a massive, massive military economy. They made a lot of tactical mistakes in the beginning, but now they're building up their army at a massive rate and training, and also their military equipment. So even if, but that's okay. You take the next stage. So NATO comes in, and the US comes in. I don't think that's going to happen, but that even then, NATO is not strong at all. They haven't, and the US hasn't got really troops to send, and then you only talk about nuclear bombs, and that's the end of the world if you start nuclear bombs. So I've learned one thing in life, whether it's negotiation with people, understanding people, or understanding between nations, that before there's a saying, before you judge somebody, you must walk 3 moon laps in his moccasins, which is, it's an old American Indian saying. It's the same as saying, you have to wear somebody's hat or shoes. And I certainly don't support Putin in this, but I don't support America either. I think America is doing the wrong thing by sending weapons and sending money, because what's happening? Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians are being killed, Russians and Ukrainians, and the war is not going anywhere. And that's why you've got to say stop. There's no correct solution for both countries. You've got to compromise, and of course the US could put pressure on. If Trump says if he becomes president, he will stop the war in a day. And of course you can. If you stop sending weapons and stop sending money, the war will stop. Okay, then you could say, yeah, but then Russia is going to get more than they deserve. Well, in wars, it's always a question of negotiated settlement. Otherwise, you just kill just too many people without gaining anything. And therefore, I think this war should be settled. I'm not going to put blame on anyone, but I can put my Russian moccasins on and understand that the Russia made it clear 20 years ago that we are not going to accept NATO encircling our country and putting missiles on our country, on the border of our country, just like the US did not during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Putin made that clear, and there was the maiden the agreement in 2014, and the Minsk agreement, in 2014, when it was clear that the Russia, there's going to be free elections in eastern Ukraine, and then the ones who want to belong to Russia could, etc. But then, of course, the West didn't really want that agreement to happen, so that they actually encouraged Ukraine to bomb the eastern territories of Ukraine. Anyway, we don't need to go into the details. What I'm saying is, I think that this situation should be solved by some statesman actually standing up and saying we got to, and it's only the US that could do it, because there isn't a single, that's one of the problems that, when you started outlining the problems in the world, there's not a single statesman in the world today. There's no leader who could actually stand up and say, we're going to do something about this. There's no Churchill or Bush, it's not Bush, I'm saying, or Thatcher, or whatever, the strong leader that actually can take the lead in these peace negotiations, and instead, sadly, no one is even thinking about peace. That's, well, basically how I see the war. As it's going now, it's going very badly for the world. It's also going badly for Ukraine, because they are, I'm like many of us reading a lot of news that is not Western propaganda. And of course, if you read that, you know that things are going very badly for Ukraine, and there is no chance, as I said, that they are going to win this war, and therefore, the West should decide to stop it now rather than and only the US can take the lead, because Europe is so weak. Europe followed the lead of the US, as I said. When US told them sanction Russia, they sanctioned, and then Germany committed suicide, as we know, when they actually stopped importing energy from Russia, and it's killing the German economy totally, and led to major inflationary problems, etc., and for all of Europe. I might be going on too long about this, but I think it's an incredibly sad situation, and there is no will to solve it. And until there is, this war will continue for many years, and the losers will be the people in the countries, and the leaders will just go on to or leave. Biden might probably not be there in the next presidential period. And the German leaders or the French leaders are also very weak right now, and the UK ones also. So they're going to not be there either. So they just hand over the baton to somebody else, whilst the people are still suffering. And that's and nobody takes that into account, and that's my main concern about what's happening now.
Yeah, I think that's the right concern. It's always the right concern in these hot conflicts. You hit the nail on the head. Two leaders, a few leaders are fighting, and the population unfortunately receives the consequences. And Russia's history in war is very similar to what we've seen thus far. They always kind of start super disorganized, ill-equipped, but then their competitive advantage becomes volume, people, right? They will throw volume at the problem. And that's beginning to occur now, and that's been, as I understand the history of Russian warfare, that's often been the case. They show up pretty unorganized, pretty ill-equipped, with odd coercion methods to get the public to actually put on a uniform. But then through sheer volume, that becomes their competitive advantage, which is heartbreaking for sure. I want to ask you, you mentioned that what we're seeing is a war between Russia and the Ukraine. What's actually occurring is a war between Russia and the US. In any way, a couple questions here. In any way, is both Russia and Ukraine just proxies? Russia being the proxy for China, Ukraine being the proxy for the US, and this is just the hot war manifestation of the trade war occurring between China and the US. And then bolting onto that, what is the strategic role that energy plays in this conflict? And how might that impact the potential of more capitulation throughout Europe? You talked about Germany kind of committing energy suicide. The German chancellor has been to Canada a year ago, begging our prime minister, Justin Trudeau, for a natural gas deal. Our brilliant prime minister informed him he couldn't make a business case to export natural gas, an asset which we have in abundance, and instead said, oh, but we'll get you hydrogen, which we don't have any. It's ridiculous. I'll pause there. But there's my questions. Next, Egon, how much of this is just a proxy war between China and the US? What is the strategic role that energy plays? And, what's the likelihood that we see capitulation throughout Europe just as a consequence of lacking access to cheap, affordable energy?
Yeah, no, clearly Russia, Russia is not a proxy for China here, because Russia are being surrounded by NATO. They're being cornered, and the Russian bear doesn't like to be cornered. totally. I mean, they made clear for certainly a couple of decades that they won't accept having NATO around them. And if you look at a map of NATO countries in 1989 and 90 and today, Russia is totally surrounded by NATO, and in 85, say, there were virtually no NATO countries around Russia. So, you can understand that is unacceptable to them with a West that is, and the West in this case is really the US. It's not really because NATO is the US too. They are just lackeys. The Europeans, they are so weak. You just take an example of the sanctions. So the US instructed Europe to sanction Russia. So Europe did because they're weak. So nobody else in the world did. Virtually nobody. So you have actually, if you look at what's happening, it's about 15% of the world population that's sanctioning Russia. The rest isn't. You take obviously not China or Japan or Africa or South America, etc. So there's actually a very small part of the world that is sanctioning Russia. The only problem is that it's a very powerful part because it is being led and directed by the US. Therefore, I think I understand. Again, wearing Russia's moccasins, they don't want to be surrounded by hostile nations. But therefore, to me, but on the other hand, the US obviously they tried to separate Germany from Russia because they obviously had a very close ties with the energy, because Germany and big parts of Europe are totally dependent on Russian energy. And there they have succeeded to the US has succeeded some part to actually make Germany less dependent on Russian energy because they're not getting enough of it. But what's happened then, that Germany is suffering dramatically and unnecessarily. They shouldn't, in my view, they should not have agreed to these sanctions. Remember, during the Roman Empire, a lot of nations were warring, but there was free trade around the world. The Romans didn't stop the trade. They didn't sanction all the worlds that were fighting, all the countries that were fighting against it. That continued. And that should have been the case here too, in my view. But it hasn't been. So there's a big problem, and Germany has actually been separated from Russia, and that's in the interest of the US. Now, coming on to your next question, the obviously separate from Russia, and also therefore separation with China also. But it's that China is getting closer to Russia. Of course, China and Russia will be, if there's a war, they'll be together. There's no question. But coming on to the energy situation, yes, of course, this is a lot of wars in modern times are about energy. And just to take an overall view on energy, and especially since we have all of these debates now, CO2 and ESG and all of that, and global warming. I study. I'm not an expert at all, but I study a lot on energy and try to understand from experts who are looking at it in a more intelligent way. And what I understand is that we have reached peak energy in the world, but even worse than that, we have also the problem is that the energy cost of producing energy has gone up from about 2% in the early 90s to 12% today. So that's the energy cost of producing energy, and so we are getting that combined with peak energy, because there are the oil the fracking is now coming to an end, and it's not very efficient either. that will mean that we are going to, for a foreseeable future, have less or more costly energy for the world as a whole. And we have today about 83% of energy in the world comes from fossil fuels. And the alternative or renewable energy is not going to compensate for turning off fossil fuel that a lot, especially the climate group wants, because there is no alternative in the short term. And the alternatives are the most obvious alternative, uranium, nuclear plants. Of course, Germany closed down all the nuclear plants. And a lot of other countries have too. France hasn't. But that's the best alternative, but that is not, that's not happening. And therefore, and we know it takes 10, 20 years to build a nuclear power plant. So there is no alternative. You can't, the wind power, wave power, and all of the other solar power, it's, from what I understand and read, that's decades away from replacing fossil fuels. And still, even if you manage to build that up and having solar cells everywhere and wind turbines everywhere, etc., you have the problem of transporting it, because it's not, you can't actually, you can't store it anywhere. So, sadly, I think the world is totally dependent on fossil fuel and will be for a very long time. So I think these hopes of having the 19 or 2050, reaching zero and having only a 1.5% increase in temperature. I don't think that's going to happen. And already most countries are already realizing there is no way they can achieve that zero increase in emissions, etc. So that energy problem is going to be with us. But just looking at the decline in fossil fuels, as I said, and not having any serious alternative for a foreseeable future will mean a decline in standards of living in the world for the next few decades at least, and that's nobody has taken that into consideration. Nobody understands it. And then if you also start closing down fossil fuels as an alternative energy source, then it's going to go even faster, of course. So anyway, so the energy is going to be a massive problem for the world, and of course, and on top of that, yes, you have the energy wars. But I think let's talk about the positive side of what's happening in the world is that the countries which have natural resources, the West is in a decline, as we have discussed, and that's going to happen. Whatever. 5 years, 10 years, whatever it will, normally these things take time, but it's in a decline. At the same time, you have all the countries with real assets. They are actually gradually going to take over the power and the world. You think about Russia having 85 trillion of natural resources. 85 trillion is a big in the world. Now, Russia is going to be a major power long term, whatever we think in the short term, and if because of their natural resources, and if they can actually do more than just export their oil or their gas or whatever else they produce, but actually start manufacturing and working with China, they'll be very powerful. And then you take the whole of the move from the West to the natural resource-rich countries, which is obviously the East, the Middle East, Africa, South America, etc. And then you're talking about you've seen the decline of the West just happening in front of our eyes, and that will be involve also the decline of the dollar and of the Western currencies. And the decline of Western standards of living. And that's what we are. Sure, you and I, or I'm much older than you are. We're not going to see that in the short term, but we will see the beginning of it, certainly, or I will. And that's the process that's going to change the world totally. Like, and we've always seen these shifts between continents and nations, and that's going to take place now also in the next few decades.
I want to pivot and use that as a segue to discuss the asset class that people trend towards during the world's most volatile moments. A buddy of mine, Luke Groman, will say that there's very few moments in history when you need to own gold, but during those moments, it's about the only thing that you want to own. And I'm watching the trend of central banks all over the world stockpiling physical gold at a rate that we haven't seen in my lifetime, and actually a lot longer, about 50 years. Most of the media coverage of this is focused on BRICS nations or BRICS allied nations. But in fact, the largest acquirer of physical gold last quarter was Singapore, a Western allied country. It is happening globally. There's a handful of reasons for this. We don't have to get into all of them. What I'm curious to hear from you, Egon, as the founder of Matterhorn Asset Management, the world's leading storage for physical metal, gold and silver. What can you tell me about the inflows that you're seeing? And what are you seeing in terms of the inflows to the physical gold space right now?
Well, let me just go back a little bit. So, we started with in the 90s, I was worried about the world and the risks in the world. And then I was looking at the consequences also, and therefore, how do you protect yourself? And that's how we started buying gold for ourselves and the people we advised in the early 2000s. At around $300, we went in heavily then at $300. And not because we were in love with gold, but we saw gold as the most natural consequence of a world which was going to have problems, both from the point of view of debt and of currency debasement and of risk and of defaults. And of course, all of that has been happening, and the gold gone from 300 when we started to just under 2,000. And at this point, you're seeing some central banks and some countries buying gold more than you've seen before, but there is not a gold rush at all. There's not. If you speak to the refiners around the world, things are quiet. I'm talking about, I'm talking about currently or even this year. It's been a quiet year. I mean, okay, so you have a little bit of a flurry when middle of March when banks go under, but overall there is no fear yet. So we've been into this business for almost 25 years, and we've gradually built up a major business helping people to preserve wealth, and by having physical outside the financial system. But this, what I've been seeing and the risks I've been worrying about and the trends I'm seeing and what Luke Groman is seeing more than ever now is that gold is going to be the beneficiary of all the problems in the world that he's also analyzing now, Luke, for example. And so what I'm saying is we've been in this for 25 years. People are buying, and it's gradual and it's steady. There's nothing dramatic yet. So what I'm seeing, what I'm expecting, it hasn't happened. So I'm actually telling my people, my management, etc., my colleagues, we haven't started yet. We haven't even started yet helping people to preserve wealth, because the real gold rush is still about to come. And that's not a gold rush for the sake of owning gold. That's a gold rush for the sake of protecting your assets against what's going to be the biggest financial and economic collapse in history. And the debasement of the currencies, I mean, that's happening in front of our eyes every day. And with the BRIC, as you mentioned, with the BRICS countries, with the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this shift from the west to the east, it's going to be and therefore shift away from dollar payments of commodities and oil, etc. That's going to be disastrous for Western currencies and with the dollar first, because that's been the main trading currency, of course. And that shift is going to have a major effect on the gold price. When Luke has mentioned Groman, and I'm in total agreement with him there that you cannot have a system of central bank reserves being held in a currency which has zero value, and now also, and it's going to be printed at a speed never seen before, because the US debt is going to increase incrementally or exponentially, so therefore, the people are going to run away from the dollar very quickly, and that means also all other Western currencies also. Instead of having who the hell wants to hold your reserves, your central bank reserves, in a currency that can be frozen, confiscated overnight, like America is doing? Nobody will want to do that. So the move away from the dollar from that point of view will be massive too. And then also from the point of view that it's not going to be petrodollar anymore, because the payments for commodities now, with a shift from east to west, from west to east, it's going to also really hit all the currencies and the dollar, of course. So therefore, the most natural replacement of the dollar as a central bank for central bank reserves will clearly be gold, which has been in the past and will be again. That's the only true investment of value that central bank should hold, not ephemeral dollars, and therefore. But of course, they can't be gold at $2,000 an ounce. It will at some point be gold at $20,000 an ounce, or $30,000. I'm not making a forecast in the gold price. What I'm saying is that gold, to be a serious reserve asset, will need to be revalued. And the other thing is, of course, with future demand, there is no more supply of gold. You can't refine more than about 3,000 tons a year. And therefore, the only way to satisfy a higher demand for gold, which will happen both from investors' point of view, private investors, and from the point of view of central banks, will be a much higher price, because there won't be more gold around. It'll just be that the gold will be more valued. And that's going to happen. Well, I have infinite patience, and only limited by my own age. But things will go on after I'm not there anymore anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But therefore, I don't care if it happens tomorrow or in a few years' time. It will happen, and it will be a massive shift, and people who don't see that will be left behind, and it'll be very costly for them.
Look, Egon, I want to thank you for coming on the show today and chatting with me. We covered a ton of ground, went sort of three big different directions. I really appreciate your insights, appreciate your time, and look forward to doing this again in the future.
Thanks very much, Jay. I really enjoyed it also. And the problem we're going to see in coming years is going to make people think differently, and I hope they will start soon, because most people haven't yet realized what's going to hit them, and people should start worrying about risk rather than thinking about making the next buck. So it'll be a major shift in perception of the world, and I think you and I will experience that.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Now, if you want to take the next step, I publish a weekly newsletter and it's free. There's a link to subscribe right beneath this video, and you can join me and 50,000 other investors weekly for this exclusive content where I share my key action items and takeaways from conversations just like this and plenty others. Thanks for stopping by.